The house looked like it had already decided something about me, not in a threatening way, not in a way you could point to, just settled. It sat there at the end of the street, porch light off, curtains drawn unevenly, like someone had left in a hurry but taken their time cleaning up after. The lawn was trimmed, the mailbox straightened. Every detail said normal, and somehow that made my chest tighten. I parked and didn't get out right away. The engine ticked as it cooled. A car passed behind me. Somewhere a radio played faintly through an open window. Life, continuing as if this house hadn't been holding its breath. When I stepped onto the porch, the wood dipped under my weight. Not weak, not broken, just tired, like it had been doing this for a long time. The key slid into the lock without resistance. I didn't like that. The door opened before I finished turning it, the way doors do when they're used to being opened. Cool air brushed my face, carrying a clean smell layered over something older, something patient. I stood in the doorway, listening. No sound, and yet the silence felt arranged, as if it had been placed there carefully, piece by piece, and now waited to see what I would do with it. Inside, the light from the street lamp fell across the hallway floor, stopping just short of the stairs. The rest of the house stayed dark, untouched by it. A small table sat against the wall. On it was a picture frame. Empty, not dusty, not cracked, just empty, like something had been removed carefully recently and for a reason that didn't need explaining. I reached out and brushed the edge of the frame with my fingertips. The glass was warm. I pulled my hand back. In the kitchen, a single mug rested on the counter, white, plain, dry. I hadn't unpacked yet. I hadn't brought any dishes into the house at all. I didn't touch the mug. I didn't need to. Behind me, somewhere deeper in the house, wood shifted. Not a footstep, more like weight adjusting, like someone changing how they stood. My breath caught, then steadied. Fear didn't rush in. It never does when something feels older than fear. I stayed very still, listening to the house listen back. And in that quiet moment, before I could reason it away, before logic or comfort had a chance to understand something clearly, deeply, and without argument, this house wasn't empty. It was keeping something.
I moved in on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesdays mean anything. They don't. That's why I chose it. No memory attached. No ritual. Just a day that would slide past unnoticed, like most things had lately. The truck pulled away before I finished closing the door. I stood there with the boxes stacked behind me, keys still warm in my palm, listening to the sound of the engine fade down the street. When it was gone, the quiet rushed back in too fast, like it had been waiting just beyond the curb. I didn't unpack right away. I set the boxes along the walls instead, careful not to block doorways. That felt important, though I couldn't explain why, leaving paths open, leaving room to move. The house felt larger empty, not spacious, occupied by space. Mornings were the easiest. The light came in low and pale, slipping through the blinds like it wasn't sure it was welcome. I drank my coffee standing at the counter because sitting felt like commitment. The floor near the sink dipped slightly under my weight, not enough to be unsafe, just enough to be noticed. It dipped the same way every time. The refrigerator hummed with a steady patience. The pipes ticked softly when the water cooled. The house had a rhythm already. I was learning it, whether I meant to or not. Outside, life carried on without curiosity. The neighbor 2 doors down walked his dog at exactly 7:10 every morning. The dog stopped at the same mailbox, sniffed the same patch of grass, then moved on. Across the street, a woman watered her plants even when it rained. The sprinkler hissed against the damp air like it was correcting something. No one waved for long. No one came over. It felt polite, distant, American in the way people mean when they say they respect privacy. Still, I had the sense of being noted, like attendance had been taken. At night, the house changed, not suddenly, gradually. The temperature dropped faster than it should have. I checked the thermostat more than once, convinced I'd imagined it. I hadn't. The numbers stayed steady. The air didn't. It thickened. Sound behaved differently after dark. Footsteps didn't echo the way they should have. My voice felt smaller when I spoke out loud, like the walls absorbed it before it could travel. I slept lightly, not poorly, not well, just aware. I woke often without knowing why, no dream lingering, no noise to blame it on, just the sense that something had shifted while I wasn't looking. Once, I woke convinced someone had been standing in the doorway. The room was empty. The doorway always was. Still, I lay there a long time afterward, staring at the darker shape of the hall beyond my bed, listening to the quiet rearrange itself. The basement door stayed locked. I noticed that on the third day. I hadn't gone down there yet. I told myself there was no rush. Basements hold boxes and tools and things you don't want to think about. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I was sure I hadn't locked it. The lock was old, heavy, set deep into the wood like it belonged there, the kind of lock you don't use unless you mean to. I tried the knob in the afternoon, sunlight pouring through the hallway window, courage easier in daylight. It didn't budge. I laughed. The sound felt thin.
Later, I said to no one. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Mail began arriving by the end of the week. Most of it was mine, bank notices, forwarded bills, the small confirmations of a life rerouting itself. Some of it wasn't. The first envelope caught my eye because it was handwritten, careful cursive, slight slant to the right. The name was unfamiliar. Margaret Hale. I recognized it anyway. The realtor had mentioned her once, casually, the way people mention weather. The previous owner lived here a long time. I set the letter on the counter. The next day, another came, then another, always addressed the same way, always handwritten, always placed just slightly apart from the rest of the mail, like it didn't want to touch anything else. I stacked them neatly. I didn't open them. I didn't throw them away. That felt important, too. The woman across the street noticed. I caught her watching one afternoon as I carried the mail inside. Her face didn't change when our eyes met. She just looked away, slow and deliberate, like she didn't want to start something she couldn't finish. I started leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using, not out of fear, out of preference. The dark felt crowded here. Corners seemed to fold in on themselves once the sun went down. Hallways stretched longer than they did during the day. The stairs creaked only when I was halfway up, never at the bottom, never at the top, always in the middle. I learned where to place my feet to avoid it. Then I noticed something else. The creak didn't happen if I stopped, only if I kept moving. The house seemed to respond to momentum. Still, nothing happened. That was the unsettling part. No sounds in the night, no doors opening, no proof, just a steady, quiet sense that the house was aware. One evening, I washed a single plate at the sink, the rest of the kitchen dark behind me. The window over the sink reflected my face back in fragments, broken by the glass. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, because I looked placed, as if the house had slotted me into a space it had been keeping empty. I turned off the light and stood there in the dark longer than necessary, listening to the refrigerator hum, to the faint click of cooling pipes, to the silence settle into its familiar shape. That night, I dreamed of rooms I hadn't seen yet, not imagined ones, existing ones. Rooms that felt small, rooms without windows, rooms that remembered breath. I woke before dawn, heart steady, mind clear, the dream already fading like it had done its job. The basement door was unlocked in the morning. I noticed it brushing past, coffee in hand, not looking for it at all. The knob turned easily. I didn't open it, not yet. Somewhere in the house, wood shifted, soft, patient, like something adjusting its weight. I stood very still, and for the first time since moving in, I understood the feeling I'd been circling without naming. This wasn't a house learning me. It was a house waiting to see how long I would pretend not to notice. I stood there for a moment longer than made sense, coffee cooling in my hands, listening to the quiet settle back into place. The knob of the basement door rested against my knuckles, cool and indifferent. It didn't pull, it didn't resist. It simply existed, like it always had. I let my hand fall away. The house didn't react. That felt intentional. I went about my morning the way people do when they're trying to prove something to themselves. I folded clothes I hadn't worn yet. I wiped down counters that were already clean. I opened windows, then closed them again when the air outside felt too thin. Every movement felt observed, not watched exactly, but accounted for, as if the house was keeping track of what I chose to do, and more importantly, what I chose not to do. The letters stayed on the counter. I passed them more than once, their edges catching the light, the name written on them steady and unhurried, Margaret Hale. It looked like a name that belonged to someone who had never rushed, someone who had taken their time with decisions and lived with them afterward. I picked up one envelope, not to open it, just to feel its weight. It was heavier than it should have been, or maybe I just expected it to be empty. I set it back down. Outside, a car door slammed. A voice carried down the street, laughing. Normal life pressed in from the edges, reminding me that nothing was wrong enough to explain how wrong it felt. I told myself I was tired, that new places always take time, that meaning is something we assign when we don't like uncertainty. Still, as I moved through the house, I noticed how naturally my steps avoided certain spots, how I paused at doorways without meaning to, how my breath changed when I passed the basement. The house didn't hurry me. It didn't need to. It knew time was already on its side. I didn't go into the basement that day, not because I was afraid, because I wasn't ready to be certain. There's a particular kind of comfort in uncertainty. As long as you don't know, you can keep pretending your instincts are exaggerating, that the unease is just your own noise, echoing back at you. I chose not to disturb that. Instead, I focused on the things that could be explained. The house was old. Old houses make sounds. Wood expands and contracts. Pipes speak to one another. Floors remember footsteps long after the people who made them are gone. That's what I told myself. I went to work. I came home. I cooked simple meals and ate them standing up. I let the television play quietly in the background, not to watch it, but to give the silence something to push against. Still, the house had its own timing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the street lights flickered on one by one, I noticed the hallway light glowing faintly beneath the door of the spare room. I hadn't been in that room yet. The door was closed. I stood at the end of the hall, staring at the line of light pooling across the floor, my shadow stretching toward it. The light didn't flicker. It didn't waver. It was steady. I told myself I must have turned it on earlier without remembering. That happens sometimes. Minds wander, days overlap. But when I opened the door, the room was empty. No furniture, no boxes, no reason for the light to be on. The switch was in the on position. I turned it off. The click sounded louder than it should have. That night, I dreamed of the staircase, not the whole thing, just the middle steps, the ones that creaked. In the dream, I stood there barefoot, unable to move forward or back, listening to the sound echo again and again beneath me. When I woke, my feet ached. The letters began arriving more frequently, sometimes 2 in one day, sometimes none for days, then 3 in a row. Always handwritten, always addressed carefully, always the same name, Margaret Hale. I noticed small changes in the handwriting, a heavier stroke here, a lighter one there, as if the person writing them had aged or tired or grown impatient. I finally opened one, not because I was ready, because it felt rude not to. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. No greeting, no signature, just a sentence written neatly in blue ink. She didn't like the dark. That was all. No context, no explanation. I read it again, slower this time, listening to the way the words landed in my chest. They didn't scare me, they didn't confuse me. They felt familiar, like something I'd always known but hadn't thought about in years. I put the letter back in the envelope and stacked them with the others. That night, the basement door creaked open an inch. I heard it from the living room. Not a loud sound, just the quiet scrape of wood against wood, the kind of sound you miss if you're distracted. I wasn't. I stood very still, my body responding before my thoughts caught up. The television murmured behind me, a laugh track rising and falling at the wrong moments. I walked to the hallway. The basement door stood slightly ajar. Not wide enough to see anything beyond it, just enough to confirm it wasn't closed anymore. I stared at the gap. The darkness beyond it felt thick, like it had weight, like it could spill if I let it. I closed the door, slowly. The latch clicked into place with a finality that didn't feel like relief. The house remained quiet, too quiet. The next morning, the mug was back on the counter. White, plain, clean, in the same spot. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. It was worn, not hot, not cold, recently used. My hands trembled slightly as I set it in the sink. I checked every room. Closets, bathroom, spare bedroom. Nothing. Everything where it should have been, except the picture frame. It was gone. The table beneath the hallway light stood empty, dust-free, like the frame had never been there at all. I felt a pressure behind my eyes then, not panic, not fear, something quieter, something closer to grief, like something had been taken that I hadn't realized I was allowed to keep. I started paying closer attention to timing, to patterns. The creak on the stairs always happened at night, never during the day. The lights turned on in rooms I hadn't entered. The temperature dropped sharply around midnight, then returned to normal just before dawn. The house moved through its own routine. I was the variable. The woman across the street finally spoke to me a week later. I was taking out the trash when she crossed over, her steps measured, her hands folded loosely in front of her. "Settling in okay?" she asked. Her smile was polite, practiced. "I think so," I said. She nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something. "Big house. Quiet, too." "Yeah." She hesitated, then softer. "It always was." I looked at her then, really looked, at the lines around her eyes, the way her gaze flicked briefly toward my basement window before returning to my face. "Did you know the previous owner?" I asked. Her smile didn't fade, but it stopped moving. "Margaret?" she said. "Oh, she kept to herself." "She lived alone?" The pause was brief, just long enough. "That's what she said." She wished me a good evening and walked back across the street without looking behind her. That night, I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, not going down, just close enough to feel the air change. The basement smelled different at night, less damp, more lived in, like breath had passed through it recently and hadn't quite left. I thought about the letter. She didn't like the dark. I thought about the locked door, the small room in my dream, the way the house seemed to respond when I moved forward, not when I stood still. Another letter arrived the next day, this one shorter. She was afraid to be forgotten. My hand shook as I folded it. I didn't stack it with the others. I put it in my pocket and carried it with me through the house, like something fragile, like something that might disappear if I set it down. That evening, I went to the basement door and unlocked it myself. The door opened easily. The stairs descended into shadow, narrow and steep. The air below was warmer now, unmistakably so. I stood at the top, listening. Nothing moved, nothing needed to. I placed one foot on the first step. The house creaked, not in protest, but acknowledgement. And for the first time since I moved in, I understood that whatever waited below wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to be seen. I stood there longer than my legs wanted to, one foot on the first step, the other still anchored to the hallway floor like it could pull me back if I changed my mind. The air below pressed upward, warm against my ankles, carrying a smell I couldn't place at first. Not rot, not mold, something softer, like fabric that had been folded too long. The light from above didn't travel far. It stopped after a few steps, leaving the rest of the staircase swallowed whole. I thought about turning on the overhead bulb, then realized there wasn't one, just a pull cord halfway down the wall, thin and slightly frayed, hanging like it had been used often. Recently, I didn't touch it. Instead, I took another step. The stair creaked low and slow, the sound stretching out as if the house wanted to hear it fully. I waited for something to happen, a sound, a reaction, a mistake I could point to and say, this is where I should have stopped. Nothing came. By the time both feet were on the stairs, my breathing had evened out, not because I was calm, but because my body had decided panic would be inefficient. Whatever this was, it wasn't sudden, it wasn't chasing me, it had patience. Halfway down, the temperature shifted again. The warmth gave way to something closer to body heat, close and contained. I became acutely aware of my own movements, the soft brush of my sleeve against the wall, the faint scuff of my shoe against the edge of a step. Each sound felt too loud. At the bottom, the floor was concrete, smooth in places, worn thin in others. The basement opened wider than I expected. Shelving lined the walls, neatly arranged, jars all empty, labeled in careful handwriting, dates, years, 1978, 1979, 1980. The handwriting matched the envelopes. Margaret Hale. I ran my fingers lightly over one of the labels. Dust lifted into the air, catching the faint light from above. The shelves themselves were clean, wiped down more recently than they should have been. Someone had been here. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a heavy curtain, was a door. Not a basement door, a smaller one. It blended into the wall, painted the same dull color, the edges softened by layers of old paint. If I hadn't been looking for something, anything, it might have disappeared completely. My stomach tightened. I stood there staring at it, my mind searching for practical explanations. Storage, a crawl space, an old pantry repurposed and forgotten. I pulled the curtain aside. The door was locked, different from the one at the top of the stairs. This lock was newer, cleaner, added later, the kind of lock you install when you don't want accidents or witnesses. My hand hovered near the knob. I didn't turn it yet. Instead, I leaned closer, pressing my ear lightly against the wood. For a moment, I heard nothing. Then, a sound so faint I almost missed it. Breathing. Slow, measured, human. I pulled back sharply, heart hammering now, my breath shallow and quick. The sound didn't stop. It didn't speed up. It didn't react to me at all. That was worse. I stepped away, my back hitting the opposite wall, the cold concrete grounding me just enough to think. This wasn't possible. I was alone in the house. I would have heard someone. I would have known. Unless I hadn't. Unless the house had decided what to show me and when. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like a door closing quietly in another room. I went upstairs without turning my back to the basement. I locked the door at the top of the stairs. Then I unlocked it again. The lock clicked open easily, obediently, like it hadn't been meant to keep me out, just slow me down. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, the letter from earlier folded and unfolded so many times the crease softened. She was afraid to be forgotten. I thought about the jars, the dates, the careful order. I thought about the breathing behind the door, how steady it had been, how unafraid. I thought about Margaret Hale. The next morning, I called the number on the realtor's card. She answered on the third ring, cheerful, practiced. There wasn't anything unusual about the house? I asked. A pause. Unusual how? Anything added, renovated, changed? She laughed lightly. Old houses get updated all the time. Was there another room in the basement? Another pause, longer. Storage space, yes. A locked room? Silence. I don't recall, she said finally. That was answer enough. I went to the county office that afternoon, requested property records, building permits, anything that would tell me what the house had been before it became mine. The clerk handed me a thin folder, thinner than it should have been. Some older records are incomplete, she said without looking up. Things go missing. I wondered how often that happened. At home, another letter waited on the counter. This one was heavier. Inside, more words than usual. She asked not to be locked in. Margaret said it was only until things were safer. She said the house would keep her. My hands shook so badly I had to sit down. There it was, not a story, not a metaphor, a confession, written slowly, carefully, over time. That night, I went back into the basement. This time, I brought a flashlight. The beam cut sharply through the darkness, exposing details I hadn't noticed before. Scuff marks near the small door, faint scratches in the paint, low enough to suggest someone sitting, waiting. I unlocked the door. The room inside was small, narrow, windowless. A bed against one wall, neatly made, the blanket tucked tight, smoothed flat like someone had taken pride in it. A small dresser beside it, one drawer slightly crooked, a mirror mounted on the wall at an angle, low, deliberate, so someone lying in the bed could see themselves. The air inside was warm, recently used. No, I whispered, the word tearing out of me before I could stop it. The mirror caught my reflection and held it there, my face pale, eyes too wide. On the wall, scratched into the paint with something sharp, were words layered over one another, some faint, some deeper. I am still here. Please don't forget me. It's too dark. I backed out of the room slowly, my chest tight, my thoughts colliding with each other. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't accident. This was choice. Margaret Hale hadn't lived alone. She'd lived with a secret, and the house had helped her keep it. I called the police. They arrived quickly, efficiently, their presence filling the house with unfamiliar noise. Radios crackled, boots thudded against the floor, the silence recoiled. They found more than I had. Beneath the concrete floor, sealed carefully, were remains. Beneath the walls, tucked behind panels, were notebooks, dozens of them. Margaret's handwriting, steady and unrepentant. She wrote about fear, about the world being unsafe, about her sister, Eleanor, being too fragile, too trusting. The house is better, one entry read. The house understands. They asked me questions I couldn't answer. How long had I known? Why hadn't I left? Why had I gone down there alone? I didn't know how to explain that the house hadn't felt dangerous. It had felt lonely. In the weeks that followed, reporters came, neighbors whispered. The woman across the street cried when she finally spoke to me. "She said she was protecting her," she murmured. "We all thought, we all believed her." The house emptied again, but it didn't feel the same. The air lifted. The walls seemed to ease back, like a long-held tension had finally been released. I stayed. Someone had to. I sleep with the doors open now, lights off. I let the dark move freely through the rooms. Sometimes, late at night, the house creaks softly, not with memory, but with relief. Because secrets don't disappear when you bury them. They wait. And houses remember who listened. The house didn't change all at once. That would have been easier. Instead, it began to loosen, slowly, carefully, like someone unclenching a fist they'd been holding tight for years. The air felt different after the police left. Not lighter, just less compressed, as if the walls had stopped leaning inward when no one was looking. I walked through the rooms afterward, noticing small things I hadn't before. How the hallway felt longer now, how the living room windows let in more light, how the stairs creaked differently, lower, less strained. The house wasn't relieved, it was exhausted. They told me I didn't have to stay, that night, that week, ever. But I did. Not out of bravery, not out of defiance, out of responsibility I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Because once you know what a place has held, leaving it empty feels like abandonment all over again. The officers returned the next day to collect the remaining notebooks. I watched them carry the boxes out carefully, like they were afraid of breaking something fragile. One of them paused at the door, glanced back inside. "Hard to believe," he said quietly. I nodded. It was. And yet, it wasn't. After they left, the silence came back, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one didn't press. It didn't watch. It moved freely, settling into corners without clinging to them. Still, something remained. Not Eleanor, not Margaret. Something else. Understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, small realizations that land out of order, forcing you to rearrange what you thought you knew. I began reading the notebooks at night. Not all of them, not in order, just one or two at a time. Margaret's handwriting was steady throughout. No trembling, no hesitation. The entries were dated carefully, years apart sometimes, but the tone never shifted. She didn't think she was cruel. That was the most unsettling part. She wrote about Eleanor like someone writes about a responsibility they didn't choose but refused to let go of. "The world is loud," one entry read. "It frightens her." Another, "She's safer where I can see her." And later, "She doesn't understand why the door has to stay locked. I've stopped trying to explain." There was no moment of doubt, no crack. Margaret didn't question herself because the house never did. I started noticing how often she mentioned it. The house is quiet today. The house keeps the cold out. The house knows when she's restless. The house wasn't just a structure to her. It was a witness, a collaborator, and maybe, in its own way, a container. I wondered how many times Eleanor had asked to leave. Not screamed, not begged, just asked. The thoughts settled into me slowly like sediment and water. I found the dresser drawer in the small room eventually. It wasn't locked anymore. Inside were small things: a comb with missing teeth, a folded sweater worn thin at the elbows, a notebook with only a few pages written in uneven handwriting, Eleanor's. The words were large, careful, childlike, though she hadn't been a child. I like when the light comes in. I don't like the dark. Margaret says I have to be quiet. The last entry wasn't finished, just one line trailing off mid-sentence. I think the house, that was it. No period, no explanation. I closed the notebook and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands resting on the blanket Eleanor had slept under. It smelled faintly of soap and something human beneath it. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress. It was warm. That shouldn't have been possible. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart racing, logic scrambling for explanations. Old houses retain heat. Basements trap warmth. Imagination fills in gaps when we don't like what's there. Still, the warmth lingered in my palm. That night, the house made a sound I hadn't heard before. A long, slow settling. Not a creak, not a groan, more like a sigh. I sat up in bed, listening, my body alert but not afraid. The sound traveled through the walls, down the stairs, into the basement, then faded. Something had shifted. In the days that followed, people came by more often. Reporters, city officials, neighbors who hadn't spoken to me before suddenly felt compelled to share their memories. She was devoted, one said. Always so protective, another added. We thought Eleanor was ill, someone else murmured. No one said imprisoned, no one said hidden. Language softened what action had hardened long ago. The woman across the street came over one afternoon, carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in a towel. She stood on the porch, not quite meeting my eyes. I heard her sometimes, she said finally. At night. My chest tightened. Eleanor? She nodded. Thought it was the house settling or the TV. I didn't want to be wrong. I understood that, wanting not to know. After she left, I sat on the porch steps watching the sun dip low. The house behind me felt still. Not tense, not alert, just present. That's when it occurred to me. The house hadn't trapped Eleanor. Margaret had. The house had simply kept what it was given. That distinction mattered. I went back into the basement that evening, not to search, not to investigate, but to sit. I brought a chair and placed it just outside the small room. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I let the shadows remain where they were. I know, I said aloud, my voice steady. The sound didn't echo. I know you were here. The air felt warmer then, not suddenly, but gradually, like the house was adjusting to the weight of words spoken out loud. I'm sorry, I added. Not because I'd caused it, because someone should have said it sooner. I don't know how long I sat there. Time behaved strangely in that space. Minutes stretched, thoughts slowed. At some point, I noticed the mirror on the wall inside the room catching the light differently, not reflecting me, reflecting space, as if something had stepped aside. I stood and crossed the threshold, entering the room fully for the first time without fear. It felt empty, not abandoned, released. The warmth was gone. The air was neutral. The house didn't react when I left the basement that night. No creaks, no shifts, no reminders. It felt complete. Weeks passed. The attention faded. Life resumed its careful distance. But I changed. I started noticing houses differently, how some seemed closed in on themselves, how others breathed openly, windows wide, doors welcoming. This house, my house, felt quieter now. Not silent, honest. One evening, as I sorted through the last of Margaret's belongings, I found a final envelope tucked inside a book, addressed to no one. Inside was a single sentence. I thought keeping her safe was the same as loving her. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one. The house held steady around me, no longer waiting, no longer watching. It had been heard, and that was the turning point. Not the discovery, not the police, not the truth, but the moment the house no longer had to keep it. That was when I understood the truth I'd been circling since the day I unlocked the door. Places don't hold secrets on their own. People give them something to carry, and when that burden is finally named, spoken, seen, acknowledged, the place doesn't celebrate, it doesn't mourn, it simply lets go. I felt that release slowly, over days, not hours. The house didn't empty itself all at once. It eased, like a body unlearning tension it had mistaken for strength. The first thing to change was the air. It moved again, not in drafts or sudden chills, but gently, the way air should. Curtains lifted when windows were open. Doors no longer felt heavy when I passed through them. The house stopped bracing itself. I started sleeping through the night, not deeply, but fully. When I woke, it was because of morning light instead of instinct. The sun found its way into the bedroom earlier now, spilling across the floorboards without hesitation. Even the creak on the stairs softened, losing its sharp edge, becoming just sound instead of signal. I noticed how much effort I'd been putting into listening, how my body had been tuned, alert, waiting. Letting go of that vigilance felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible, like setting something down after carrying it too long and suddenly worrying you might need it again. The basement door stayed open. I didn't force it. I didn't make a point of it. I just stopped closing it. The space below no longer pressed upward. The warmth was gone, replaced by the neutral cool of concrete and stone. The small room felt different too, smaller somehow, less significant. It was just a room now, a wrong one, but not a living one. I removed the bed a few days later, not because I wanted to erase what had happened, but because it didn't belong there anymore. The mattress sagged when we lifted it, older than it looked, heavier than it should have been. The movers didn't ask questions. They never do. When the room was empty, I stood inside it and listened. Nothing answered. That felt right. The mirror came down next. I wrapped it carefully, more carefully than necessary, like it might break if handled roughly. When I carried it upstairs, the reflection caught me at an odd angle, my face calm, eyes steady. I looked like someone who had survived something quietly. Outside, life resumed its distance. Neighbors waved again. The woman across the street stopped watching my windows. Her gaze softened when she passed, no longer cautious, no longer burdened by whatever she'd chosen not to know for so long. We didn't talk about Eleanor. We didn't talk about Margaret. Some truths are acknowledged without being revisited. The notebooks were returned weeks later, after investigations and paperwork and signatures. They arrived in a plain cardboard box, heavier than memory, but lighter than guilt. I didn't read them again. I didn't need to. What mattered had already settled. Still, there were moments, small, unexpected ones, when the weight of it returned. Like when I folded laundry and caught myself matching socks the way Eleanor had written she liked them. Like when I noticed I kept one lamp on in the hallway at night, not for myself, but because the dark no longer felt like something to conquer. The house didn't mind. It accepted these things without comment. One evening, as fall deepened into winter, I sat on the living room floor with my back against the wall, listening to the heater cycle on and off. The sound traveled evenly through the rooms, no longer swallowed, no longer distorted. I pressed my palm flat against the floor. cold, solid, present. I realized then how close I'd come to leaving. How easily I could have told myself this wasn't mine to hold, that responsibility ends at ownership, that some stories are better left untouched. But walking away wouldn't have undone what the house had carried. It would have just asked it to keep holding it alone. That felt wrong. I started making small changes after that. Not renovations, not erasures, just acknowledgments. I opened the windows more often, let sounds in, let the house hear the street again, the laughter, the passing cars, the ordinary noise of people being alive. I painted over the scratches in the small room, not thickly, not carelessly, just enough to soften them, to say, I see that you were here. You don't have to keep saying it now. I planted something in the backyard in early spring. Nothing dramatic, just a small tree. The soil was stubborn, packed tight, like it had resisted change for a long time. I worked slowly, carefully, breaking it apart by hand when the shovel met too much resistance. When I finished, my arms ached and my nails were dirty and my chest felt lighter than it had in months. The tree stood there quietly, roots settling into ground that had learned to hold weight. That night, the house creaked once. Not the old sound, a new one. Low, easy, like a body adjusting in sleep. I didn't sit up. I didn't listen harder. I let it pass. The next morning, sunlight filled the hallway all the way to the basement steps. For the first time, it didn't stop short. I stood there a moment, coffee in hand, watching the light rest on the concrete below. It felt like an invitation, not to uncover, not to investigate, but to live without flinching. I understood then that the turning point hadn't been the discovery. It hadn't been the police or the notebooks or the words scratched into the wall. It had been the moment the house was allowed to stop being careful. Because secrecy requires effort, and once that effort ends, what remains is just space. Room to breathe, room to move forward, room for something else to grow. I finished my coffee and went back upstairs, leaving the basement as it was. Open, quiet, unremarkable. The house didn't follow me. It didn't need to. It had already done what it was asked to do. And now, finally, it was done. The house did not return to normal. I want to be clear about that. It didn't become cheerful. It didn't turn light or warm in the way people expect healing to look. It didn't suddenly feel like a place meant for laughter or noise. What it became was honest. That distinction mattered more than I realized at first. Days passed without incident, weeks, then months. The calendar filled in the way calendars always do, with appointments and reminders and obligations that had nothing to do with what the house had once held. Life resumed its shape around me, but the house kept its own. I noticed it in small ways, in how doors rested more easily in their frames, and how the walls no longer seemed to lean inward when night came, and how silence behaved now, no longer arranged, no longer deliberate, just quiet. The kind that doesn't ask anything of you. I stopped listening for things I didn't want to hear. My body unlearned its vigilance slowly, like a habit formed over years, and released one careful breath at a time. Sometimes, late at night, I would walk through the rooms without turning on the lights, not to test myself, not to prove anything, just because I could. The dark no longer felt crowded. It felt empty. And emptiness, I learned, is not the same as absence. One evening, long after the last of the reporters had stopped calling and the neighbors had returned to their measured distance, I found myself standing in the basement doorway again, not out of compulsion, out of curiosity. The stairs descended quietly now. The old creak had softened into something closer to memory than warning. The air below was cool, neutral, untouched. The small room was still there. Of course it was. I hadn't erased it. I hadn't filled it in or sealed it away. I'd learned enough by then to know that pretending something never existed only gives it another way to stay. The room stood empty. No bed, no mirror, no markings on the wall, just four walls and a concrete floor. I stood in the doorway and waited for the feeling that at once pressed into my chest when I came near this space. It didn't arrive. Instead, there was only a dull ache behind my ribs, not fear, not dread, grief, not mine, but carried, finally, without resistance. "I remember," I said quietly. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. I closed the door, not locked, just shut, and went upstairs. That was the last time I went looking for something in that house. The climax, I realized later, didn't come with discovery or confrontation or noise. It came with a choice. The choice to stop asking the house to explain itself. The choice to stop demanding meaning from something that had already given everything it could. I chose to live there, not as penance, not as obligation, but as witness. Spring came slowly that year. The tree I'd planted in the backyard held on stubbornly, its branches bare longer than I expected. I worried I'd chosen the wrong spot, the wrong season, that I'd asked too much of soil that had already carried too much weight. Then, one morning, without announcement, green appeared, small, fragile, undeniable. I stood at the window longer than necessary, watching the leaves catch the light. The house around me stayed still, steady, like it had learned when to step back. I thought about Eleanor then, not as a victim, not as a secret, but as a person who had wanted light. I kept the hallway lamp on at night after that, not because the dark frightened me, because it didn't have to anymore. People eventually stopped asking questions. New neighbors moved in down the street. The old ones aged into softer versions of themselves. Memory thinned the way it always does when no one keeps sharpening it. The house faded into the background of the neighborhood, just another place. That too felt right. One afternoon, years later, I found a small crack in the wall near the stairs. Not structural, just cosmetic, the kind that happens when houses settle into themselves over time. I considered fixing it. Then I didn't. Some marks are not damage. They are evidence of endurance. I traced the line once with my finger and left it there, thin and unremarkable, visible only if you knew where to look. At night, when the house creaked, it sounded like age instead of memory. When it shifted, it did so openly, without caution. I slept deeply, fully. On anniversaries I didn't mark, something in me would still pause, not with pain, with recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that something had happened here that couldn't be undone, but also didn't need to be repeated. The house never asked me to keep it secret. That was the difference. It had only needed someone to stop pretending it wasn't there. The final moment came quietly, the way all real endings do. I was sitting at the kitchen table one evening sorting through old paperwork when I found the deed transfer again, my name printed cleanly beneath Margaret Hale's. I stared at it longer than necessary. Ownership is a strange word. It suggests control, but what it really means is responsibility. I folded the paper and put it away. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, the house held steady around me, neither closing in nor pushing back. For the first time, I understood what it meant for a place to rest. Not empty, not full, at peace. Before bed, I walked through the house one last time, checking doors out of habit more than need. When I reached the basement, I paused. The door stood open. I considered closing it. Then I left it as it was. Some things don't need to be sealed anymore. Upstairs, I turned off the lights and lay down, the house settling gently around me like it knew the difference between holding and letting go. As sleep came, I thought, not for the first time, but for the last, about how easily this story could have remained buried. How many people had sensed something and chosen silence instead. How close I'd come to doing the same. Secrets don't survive because they're powerful. They survive because they're ignored. This one didn't get that luxury, and because of that, the house didn't have to carry it anymore. It could finally be what it had always been trying to be, just a place, standing, breathing, remembering. Not the way people think you remember, like a photo album you can flip through when you're bored. More like the way your body remembers cold water, the way your palms remember a certain kind of doorknob, the way your throat tightens before you even know why. That's what the house did to me. It didn't show me a clean story.
It gave me pieces. A smell that didn't belong, a sound that came from nowhere, a corner of the hallway where the air always felt a degree colder, like the walls were holding their breath. I stood there a long time that afternoon, just staring at the closed linen closet like it had offended me, like it had said something under its breath. The rest of the house kept doing what houses do, settling, sighing, ticking quietly in the bones. The refrigerator hummed. The old ceiling fan clicked once every rotation like it was counting something. I told myself I was tired, that grief does strange things to attention, that moving back into an old place can make you jumpy. But the truth was simpler. The house had started to behave like it had been waiting for me to come back and finish something I'd never started. The linen closet door was painted the same soft white as the trim, 3 coats at least, thick enough that you couldn't see the older life underneath unless the light hit it the right way. But when I put my hand on the knob, I felt it. A faint vibration. Not electrical, not mechanical, just pressure, like the door didn't want to be opened. My hand stayed there, fingers curled around the cool metal, and I listened. I don't know what I expected. A voice? A thud? Some dramatic proof that I wasn't imagining this. Nothing came, just the quiet of a house that knew how to keep secrets. I opened it anyway. The linen closet smelled like dried lavender and stale cardboard, old sheets folded with too much care, towels stacked in neat piles that didn't match, a shoebox on the top shelf with my mother's handwriting on it, sharp and slanted, like she was always in a hurry. I lifted the box down slowly. Dust floated up in thin, lazy strands. The lid fought me a little, stuck from humidity or time, and when it finally gave, the sound was small, but it echoed. Inside were things I hadn't thought about in years. A pair of baby shoes that were never mine, a yellowed church program with a pressed flower inside, a postcard from somewhere warm, addressed to my mom, signed with a name I didn't recognize, and under all of it, a key. It was wrapped in a napkin like someone had been trying to keep it from touching anything else. The napkin had brown stains on it, old ones, the kind you couldn't tell were coffee or rust or something worse unless you wanted to know. I picked up the key. Heavy. Too heavy for a normal interior lock. Not a house key, Not a mailbox key. Something older. Something meant for something that didn't get opened often. My stomach sank in that quiet, unavoidable way, like my body had already seen the end of this story and was trying to warn my mind. I held the key in my palm and looked around the closet again. It was just shelves, just linens, just a lifetime of ordinary things. But now, the air felt different. Like the house had tilted slightly, just enough to let something slide toward me. I didn't know what the key went to, but I knew it belonged to this house, and I knew it had been waiting for my hand. That night, I set the key on the kitchen counter and tried to cook dinner like I was normal. I cut onions. I boiled pasta. I let the local news mumble in the background because silence felt too wide. Every few minutes, my eyes went back to the counter, to the key, like it was a small animal that might move if I looked away too long. I ate standing up, barely tasting anything. When the sun finally went down, the house got louder in that subtle way old houses do. Not loud, just present. The wood in the walls contracting, the pipes clicking, the floorboards making tiny complaints when the temperature dropped. I washed the dishes slowly. I wiped the counter twice. I turned the key over once, then again, tracing the shape of it with my thumb like I was trying to read it in Braille. One end was smooth. The other had teeth cut into it, clean, deliberate. A key made for a specific lock. A lock made to keep something in, or keep someone out. I thought about calling someone, a locksmith, a friend, my cousin who lived 20 minutes away and always answered the phone like she was already annoyed. But I didn't. Because there are some things you don't invite witnesses to, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're not ready to watch your own face when you learn the truth. I waited until the house fell asleep, until the neighborhood outside was quiet enough that the headlights on the road were rare, like slow-moving fish. I turned off the lights. I stood in the dark kitchen with the key cold in my hand, and I listened. The house listened back. It's hard to explain that feeling, like you're not alone, but not in a supernatural way, more like the past is sitting on the couch, arms folded, watching to see if you're going to act right. I walked down the hallway barefoot. The floor was cold. The boards creaked under me in familiar places as if my weight still belonged here. Halfway down, I stopped by the linen closet again, just because it was there. But my hand didn't go to that knob this time. My eyes drifted past it to the end of the hallway, to the door that led to the basement. The basement door was always there, always ignored. In my childhood, it wasn't a place we went unless we had to. It smelled like damp concrete and old paint. It held Christmas decorations, broken chairs, and the kind of silence that made you want to talk louder than necessary. My mother didn't like it down there. She never said why. She just called it downstairs, like it was a person she didn't trust. I stood at the basement door and realized I hadn't been down there since I moved back, not once. Like some part of me had been unconsciously obeying an old rule. Don't go. Don't look. Let sleeping things sleep. But the key felt heavier now, almost impatient. I put my hand on the basement doorknob. The metal was colder than it should have been. I turned it. The door opened with that long, reluctant sigh, wood against wood, like it was tired of pretending it could stay shut forever. The smell hit me first, not just dampness, something else underneath it. A stale sweetness, like old cardboard, like wet earth, like something that had been sealed away too long. I switched on the light at the top of the stairs. The bulb flickered,
For a second, the basement was a stuttering film reel, dark, light, dark, showing me flashes of stacked boxes and bare concrete and the unfinished ceiling with wires hanging like thin veins. Then the light held steady. I started down the steps. Each step complained under my weight. The handrail was rough under my palm, the wood worn smooth in places where hands had held it in fear or hurry. At the bottom, the air was colder, heavier. The basement always felt like it had its own weather. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The space looked the same as I remembered. Mostly. Boxes along the walls, a laundry sink that hadn't been used in years, a metal shelf holding paint cans and a jar of screws. But something had changed. Or maybe it hadn't changed. Maybe I had. In the far corner, behind the shelf, there was a door I didn't remember. Not a full-size door, smaller, almost like a utility access. It was painted the same color as the basement wall, which meant you could miss it if you weren't looking for a reason to find it. My throat went tight, because suddenly the key made sense. I walked toward that corner slowly, like the air might break if I moved too fast. Up close, I saw the outline of the door more clearly. A thin frame, a simple knob, and a lock. Not a modern one, an older lock with a keyhole shaped like an eye. My hand shook when I lifted the key, not because I was afraid of ghosts, because I was afraid of my mother. Not the living woman she was back then, but the version of her that lived in my memories. The woman with tight lips and tired eyes, and a way of telling you it's fine that meant it absolutely wasn't. I put the key into the lock. It slid in smooth, too smooth, like it had been used, like it hadn't been sitting untouched for decades the way I wanted to believe. I turned it. The lock clicked. A small sound, but it felt like a gunshot in that quiet basement. I pulled the door open. At first, I thought it was just storage, a narrow little space, like a crawl area that someone had finished halfway. Then I saw the floor. It wasn't bare concrete. It was covered. Plastic sheeting, old and cloudy, taped down at the edges, like someone had tried to make sure nothing seeped through. My stomach dropped. The smell got stronger. Earth, metal, something old. A knot of panic rose in my chest, the kind that makes your breath shallow and your skin feel too tight. I didn't step in, not yet. I just stood in the doorway, holding the door with one hand like I could still close it and pretend this never happened. Then my eyes landed on something against the back wall, a small wooden trunk, the kind people used to store quilts in. It had a brass latch, and on top of it, a photograph, a Polaroid, edges curled, the image faded but still clear enough. It showed a woman standing in front of this house, not my mother, not me. A woman with dark hair pulled back, wearing a denim jacket, one hand resting on her belly like she was pregnant. She was smiling, but not with her eyes. Her eyes looked like they were asking for help. My chest tightened so hard it felt like the air left my lungs, because I knew that face, not from real memory, from whispers, from half sentences, from the way my mom would go silent when certain names came up. Her name was Maribel. She lived here before us. That was all anyone ever said. She moved away. She wasn't well. It wasn't our business. And my mother had always ended those conversations with a sharp finality, like she was cutting the string before it could pull something back into the room. I reached for the Polaroid with trembling fingers. The paper was cool, slightly sticky from age. On the bottom, in black marker, someone had written a date, and underneath the date, a single word, promise. My legs felt weak. I leaned against the doorframe to steady myself because suddenly the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a witness. It was a container, a place that had held something no one wanted to name. I looked down at the trunk, at the latch, at the plastic on the floor, like a cheap attempt at a clean conscience. And I realized, with a sick clarity, that I hadn't found a forgotten space. I had found a deliberate one. Someone had made this room. Someone had locked it. Someone had kept the key hidden in clean towels and lavender, like they thought that would make it less ugly. I swallowed hard. My mouth tasted like metal. I bent down and touched the trunk latch. It was cold. My fingers hesitated. The part of me that still wanted my mother to be only my mother, only tired, only strict, only human, begged me to stop. But another part of me, the part that had spent years feeling like there was a sentence missing from our family story, pushed forward. I opened the trunk. The lid creaked, stiff at first, then gave. Inside were papers, old ones, folders with brittle edges, letters tied with string, and at the very bottom, a small bundle wrapped in a baby blanket, white once, now yellowed. I stared at it for a long time without touching it. My hands hovered over it like I was afraid it might bite. And then I heard something upstairs. A sound so quiet, I almost convinced myself it was the house settling. But it wasn't. It was a footstep. A soft, careful step, like someone was walking through my kitchen above me. My blood went cold. I stood up so fast my head swam. I didn't move. I listened. Another step, then another, slow, unhurried, like whoever it was knew exactly where everything creaked, like they'd walked this house in the dark before. I backed away from the little room, leaving the trunk open, leaving the Polaroid on the floor, leaving the secret exposed like a wound. I pulled the small door closed without locking it. My fingers fumbled. The basement air felt too thick to breathe. The footsteps upstairs stopped. Silence. Then a soft sound like a cabinet closing. My heart hammered. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the shadow of the stairwell. The light at the top was off now. I was sure I had left it on. I was sure. And in the darkness above, the house held still. Not protective, not comforting, just waiting. Like it was holding its secret in its mouth, and it had finally decided to let me taste it. I tightened my grip on the key. I took one slow step toward the stairs, every muscle braced for something I couldn't name, because I understood in that moment the worst part wasn't what I'd found. It was what the house had always known, and what someone upstairs was trying to make sure I didn't carry into the light. Just a place. Thank you for watching. Your trust, your time, and your support truly mean everything. If this video brought you value, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel reach those who need it most. Stay focused, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next video.